Hi, this is Wade Frazier. This is November 13th, 2005. I made one video so far, and I'm going to make quite a few in this series of videos, which is about free energy pursuit, in fact, the fringes in general, and the hazards that you have on the fringes, which are many. Uh, Again, the previous video, I ended it with when I made my desperate prayer to have some guidance after I felt trapped in my career, trapped in Los Angeles. And for the second time in my life, I did made that prayer for the second time in my life. The voice answered, and I moved to Seattle. It suggests I moved to Seattle, and I did. And 10 days after that voice spoke, I was interviewing at Dennis's company, which was like a lightning bolt hit me when this recruiter said, "Can anybody ready for an interview with the solar company?" And that was Dennis's company. So anyway, before I get to my journey with Dennis, I think for this to make sense, a lot of sense, I need to sketch Dennis's journey before I met him. And then our journey together will make much more sense and make it much more authentic. The information that I'm drawing upon was, again, I lived with him and his family for about a year when I became his partner. Dennis saw me as the heir apparent. And so we spent the winter of '87. I remember late in the night listening to Dennis tell the story of his life. And so I listened a lot. Yes. And then I also, his wife was there for a lot of it also. So I heard a lot about it from her also. And then Dennis wrote a couple books from his behind bars. The first one was called My Quest. The second one was called The Alternative. One was written from jail, another was written from prison. And so drawing on all of that, and some anecdotes from other people who were also involved in this. I caught other information. So here we go. So Dennis was born in 1946 in Yakima, Washington, and he was a member of a family of migrant farm workers. And this is when white people still did this in the United States. I mean, those days are long gone. I don't think there are any white migrant farm workers in the United States any longer. It's all Mexicans, poor people, right? Poor Mexicans, etc. Um, One of the years he was growing up, Dennis said he attended more than 10 schools in one year. And that gives you an idea of how much they moved around. And Dennis's father was raised the same way, and he left home at age like 13. And when Dennis got to be 13, his dad said, "Well, son, I'm done. You're on your own." And Dennis left home, left home at age 13 himself, and he was on his own. And Dennis, again, his Dennis's IQ's up in the genius range. Again, he's got me by a bit, just like my mentor did. So and I was, a pupil of these. I was mentored by these two world-class geniuses, which is I became a student of genius. And one of the things I learned about genius mentalities is that it can be pretty simple. What they do is they look at situations, etc., with fresh eyes, like a child, and they'll just look at things and without the presumptions that cloud so many of our own perceptions, and they can see to the heart of the matter. And I've seen this over and over again. It's an amazing ability to be able to do that. And Dennis had that. Definitely had that ability, has that ability. And that was when those childlike perceptions often were their keenest insights. So when Dennis left home at age 13, he was on his own. He was homeless. And so he worked. I know he worked to feed and clothe himself, and he kept going to school. But he ended up sleeping like in abandoned homes and wherever he could. And that milieu, Dennis said that a young 13-year-old boy was risking his life to do that. He said, in the kind of men who would also live in abandoned homes and stuff wouldn't hesitate to kill somebody like Dennis. So Dennis learned how to stay alive, and he learned how to sleep in secret spots, literally booby trap the staircase to the upper floor, put an alarm on it, etc., so he could get out if he needed to. Yeah, he was living dangerously from age 13 on. And he kept going to school. And in his last 2 years of high school, he actually slept in the janitor's closet at school secretly. So he snuck into the janitor's closet and slept. That's where he slept the last 2 years of school. And then 2 weeks before graduation, he got caught. Today, if a homeless kid was doing that, he'd be like some news story about this wonderful kid who kept going to school even though he was homeless. Back then, they just expelled him. They got expelled from school for doing that. They was trespassing or whatever. And so that's what it was like back then. Well, anyway, so after he got expelled, Dennis did what agrarian youth have been doing in the United States for a long time, which was join the military. And so I think it was 1964 that he did that. In fact, just before began the invasion of Vietnam. On a quick aside, in previous posts, I mentioned my mentor and all of his inventions. Well, one of his innovations was actually used to fabricate the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was Johnson's justification for escalating the invasion of Vietnam. So I have quite a few connections to all of this. So Dennis joined the military. He was a paratrooping medic, and so stationed in Germany. And it was not easy for Dennis at first. And I don't know, probably being on age 13, etc., he was kind of, let's say, strong-headed maybe. He didn't seem to fit in. In fact, a superior officer took him to task one day, and he said, Dennis, you're very capable, but you don't get it yet. And so anyway, Dennis eventually did. In fact, what happened was that he ended up taking on a project that was basically getting an infirmary to pass an inspection, some sort of army inspection, which that infirmary had never passed inspection before. And so Dennis took it on as his personal project to get this infirmary to pass inspection. And he was working like 24/7 to do this. And in fact, during that, he became so exhausted, he actually had an out-of-body experience. And he had no framework to understand what had happened, but he was wandering around the base out of his body that night. Yeah, he didn't understand what was happening, but that's when people have out of bodies and NDEs and stuff. That's when your physical being's tapped out. That's quite often when you'll separate from your body like that. And so anyway, what happened though was that Dennis, he passed the inspection, passed with flying colors. In fact, it was a big deal. In fact, Dennis was named Soldier of the Month on his base. He got literally a letter from Lyman Lemnitzer, who used to be the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Kennedy. In fact, he's the one who authored Operation Northwoods, which was the Pentagon's counterpart of the Operation that ended up getting Jack Kennedy killed. And so in my Kennedy writings, I discussed that a bit. And so anyway, yeah, when Dennis told me it was Lemnitzer, I was like, isn't that interesting? And so anyway, so Lemnitzer actually wrote to Dennis, and he said he owed him a favor, and Dennis called in the favor to say, I'd like to be exempt from going to Vietnam. And it wasn't because Dennis was chicken. He just didn't want to go. He wanted to stay in Germany. So anyway, but just before he, about a month before discharge, he ended up getting inducted into a mission in Vietnam. In fact, Dennis, when all that stuff with Lemnitzer, et cetera, Dennis was inducted into Special Forces. So he was part of Special Forces. He was still a medic, but now he's a Special Forces medic. And that's why he got inducted into this operation there in Vietnam. And he wrote about it a bit in The Alternative a little. And yeah, he killed people. That's what soldiers do. And Dennis, though, Dennis eventually realized that the USA's mission in Vietnam was not a noble one. And Dennis he's not proud of his days in Vietnam. He'd like to forget them, which is, as most soldiers, particularly soldiers that have been in combat. And so, and for me, though, that is, how to say it, emblematic of what a true believer in American nationalism Dennis was at that time. That was his surrogate religion. Yeah, he didn't believe the fire and brimstone sermons that his mother dragged him to when he was a kid, but American nationalism was his big surrogate religion. Back in the army, he would get in fistfights with soldiers if they disparaged the United States. That was what Dennis was like before I knew him. Yeah, that would have been a fly on the wall to see that when Dennis was young. Anyway, then he got discharged and then returned to Yakima. And his first job was actually loading munitions to Vietnam. And then he went to college. So he went to a local community college. And again, with Dennis was a straight A student, top of his class. In fact, became president. He became president of his class there at the college. And after some period of time, maybe in the first year, it came out that he had not graduated from high school. It was actually kind of a scandal. And again, today it would be like heroic, but back then it was like, oh my God, he didn't graduate high school, but he was a straight A student, president of his class. And so actually the president of the college made an exception in Dennis's case, an exemption. They decided not to expel him. Yeah, crazy. Straight A student expel you because, oh, you didn't graduate high school. And that's how it was back then. And so Dennis was there in Yakima going to school, working. And in fact, Dennis's big dream was joining the American middle class. Again, from a migrant farm worker, and he's a boomer, baby boomer. So his big dream was joining the American middle class and living the American dream. And so what happened is that one day I called it an awakening moment. The people that I'm looking for, we all had them. We all had these moments when our beliefs and indoctrination encountered reality through our experiences. And sometimes you almost didn't survive. In fact, Dennis almost didn't survive his moment of awakening. And he's written about it a little. Actually, he hasn't written about it much, but I've heard the story. So I will tell it. And I've written about this before. But anyway, so what happened was Dennis, he bought a Mustang convertible, and he decided to get a loan from the bank, local bank, like $200 loan. And not because he needed the money, but because he wanted to establish a credit rating, play the game of reaching middle class respectability. And this loan he was going to get was part of his grand plan to, reach middle class respectability. And what happened is that he's in the bank, probably one of the few times he'd been in the bank in his life to that point. Anyway, the branch manager hands him the money, a $200 loan, and then it starts to walk out of the bank. And in through the doors comes this man with several small children behind, following him in, kind of like a duck with 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 ducklings behind him. And this was his children. And anyway, this man was a migrant farm worker. It had been a bad harvest year that year. And what happened was the man's wife died, and he was widowed, and he had like 4 children, and they were starving, and they were living in their car. And so this man did what, and again, this was, how to say it, I would say maybe unusual, maybe not. But what happened is this man walked into the bank, seeing if he could get help from the bank. And you can imagine what a starving migrant farm worker's reception would be walking into a bank like that. But Dennis, this was anyway. This was a tableau that was unfolding right in front of Dennis. And this man came in with his 4 children following him, and he went up to the branch manager and he said, it's been a hard year. My wife died. We're sleeping in my car. Can you help us? And of course, the branch manager, like probably all branch managers, said, there's charities for this stuff. You don't go to a bank for this kind of help. There's a Salvation Army down the street. You need to go there. And the branch manager apparently was pretty cold about it. Like, scram, get out of here. And anyway, Dennis was witnessing this exchange take place. And this man was actually kind of acting like a beggar, And anyway, and Dennis, his American dream ideals went up in smoke in that bank lobby. And Also, what I've a little editorializing here is the thing where I had mine. The people like me. We all had these kind of awakening moments, but it usually wasn't like one event. It was a slow kind of building up of cognitive dissonance, where finally one day you it became clear. You saw something that you hadn't seen before, and you go, oh. And what happened was your ideals went up in smoke. So the stuff you signed up for is like you realize it was illusory, and that's how you become a disillusioned idealist. So, anyways, as Dennis, he had his disillusioning idealist moment in the bank there, and anyway, the man turned around and started walking out the door with his children trailing behind him, and Dennis, and this is Dennis. This is standard classic Dennis. So Dennis called out to the man and said, "Sir, wait, don't leave. This is your lucky day." And it was the banker was going to give you $200, and Dennis took the loan money he just got and slapped it into the man's hands. And then Dennis turned around to the branch manager and said, "As long as either one of us lives, you will never see that money again." And then Dennis said, "Furthermore, you get a new car." And Dennis takes out the keys to his Mustang and gives them to this man. And this man's eyes were bugging out of his head as Dennis is doing this. And then Dennis walks out of the bank. And of course, he gave his car away, so he had to take the bus home. But he takes, and he's crying all the way. I mean, his illusions are just shattered. And so he goes home, and again, he was an ex-soldier, etc. And he goes home, and he goes in his closet, and he gets his shotgun out, and he he sticks the barrel in his mouth, and he's about ready to pull the trigger. That's what Dennis's reaction was going to be, to have his nationalist dreams go up in smoke. And just as he's about to pull the trigger, he hears a voice in his head. And Dennis and I haven't talked about it, so some people actually hear a voice. Mine was alien thoughts. I don't know which one it was with Dennis. If it was an actual voice, he heard it, or it was just alien thoughts. I don't know. But what happened is that the voice in his head, as he's about ready to pull the trigger, said, "Wait, what are you doing?" Dennis, where's this voice coming from? Well, anyway, Dennis is like, "Well, I'm about ready to exit this damn world." And Dennis proceeds to have a conversation with his voice in his head. And this voice was kind of Socratic. And the voice said, "Okay, let me get this straight. So you were raised and you believed in this ideal of an America, this America where, freedom and helping each other. And again, the American dream, you believed in this America. And you just realized it didn't exist. And so you're going to kill yourself because it doesn't exist." Dennis is like, "Yeah." And what happened is that by the end of this, I think it was a half hour of Dennis in mental conversation with his voice. And at the end of the half hour, Dennis made a deal with the voice. And instead of killing himself, he would live his life to try to see that dream become a reality. And so and Dennis has said every day since then has been gravy, because he was this close to pulling the trigger. And so that was a major turning point for Dennis. I mean, maybe the major turning point of his life when that happened. And so ever since then, he had been, trying to do what he could to make the America that he dreamed existed, noble, right? Anyway, I don't have the nationalistic dream that Dennis has. Mine are a little different, but I get it. I get what he was trying to do, what he's been doing all these years. That was, my God, that was, yeah, what, almost 60 years ago? Yeah, a long time ago. Dennis calls that voice God. The other people I know this has happened to, they don't, in my experience, the voice doesn't identify itself. And my guess was mine was my soul. Dennis says it was his God. Maybe he's right. I don't know. But I think usually what happens when those voices come through is your soul trying to help out as you're going astray. That's what souls do. So when he was going to school, and so when you were, Washington youth, one almost rite of passage for Washington youth back then. It may still be the case, I'm not sure. Is that in the summertime they'd go up and work in Alaska on fishing boats and on the land. They just in the summer in Alaska there was seasonal work, and a lot of youth from Washington would spend summers in Alaska to make money. And so Dennis did that after I think a couple of years of his junior college experience, and he worked on a radar base way out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, way out there, and he would work in the infirmary. And it was a radar base. I think it had 2,000 men on it, and he worked in the infirmary there, and he worked under an MD. And Dennis, when he was in the military, when he was a medic in the Army, he actually performed a tracheotomy, made the incision with an appendectomy. And Dennis wanted to become a surgeon. That was his big dream, was to become a surgeon. And so anyway, at the infirmary where he worked, it was an MD who ran it. And this man was, he pioneered heart surgeries for children and buried most of his patients. And you can imagine the emotional devastation of burying all your child patients. And anyway, this man, he told Dennis, he took Dennis under his wing. He said, Dennis, if you forego your dreams of becoming a surgeon, I will pay for the rest of your college. Dennis thanked him for that offer and filed that away. And so what happened was that soon after Dennis started working there, he had a girlfriend. In fact, one of the only women within like 100 miles. He was his girlfriend. And after about a month, she told Dennis, she goes, Dennis, you think you're that good looking, man? And why do you think I'm your girlfriend? Well, it turns out that what she was she was sort of the bait that the local organized crime syndicate was using to recruit Dennis into becoming their dispenser for their illicit drugs on the base to those 2,000 men. And so, to dispense them through the infirmary. And so Dennis she confesses this to him, and Dennis is all of a sudden, oh my God, what do I do? In fact, he actually flew home to Yakima and asked his father what to do. His father just advised self-preservation, but that's not who Dennis was. And so what Dennis did was he went to the FBI and he said, hey, these mobsters here are trying to get me to work for them. And what I'll do is I will act like I'm considering their pitch, but how about, I help you bust them? And he dumped it right in the FBI, and the FBI said, sure, okay. So anyway, so Dennis, for the next month or so, he actually went to meetings, etc., like he was gonna, but he was telling the FBI everything, not even wore a wire, I don't know. But what happened was after a month or so of this, the FBI pulled the sting and busted this whole, literally this whole line of mobsters got busted by the FBI. They're in Alaska. Yeah, and about a day later, Dennis survived his first hit attempt from the mob. And then the FBI said, it's not safe for you to be in the state any longer. You need to leave. And so anyway, Dennis actually had a 12 policeman escort to leave the state. In fact, at the airport, he was at the airport with this 12-man bodyguard. And he actually went into the bathroom just before he got on the plane, and one of the cops followed him in the bathroom. And one of the cops pulled out a Bowie knife and tried to kill Dennis in the bathroom. And Dennis used his special forces skill set to survive the encounter. Still has a scar on his arm from that, but he survived. And that hitman went away for a long time. And then Dennis left the state. And when he left the state, I guess that MD had already retired, and he was from New Jersey. And so anyway, so Dennis, gave him a ring and said, is that offer still good? And the guy said, yeah. So Dennis ends up moving to New Jersey, went to Fairleigh Dickinson University. Dennis studied social psychology. And again, Dennis is a utopian thinker. So in fact, his senior project, kind of like a thesis. I had one when I was in college. In your senior year, you do this kind of research project. And Dennis did a research project on utopian societies and utopian, literature, et cetera. And that was, again, Dennis, he wanted to make utopia happen. So anyway, then Dennis, that doctor, I guess, was pretty well to do. And what happened was Dennis got introduced to the Eastern oligarchy there in New Jersey. And kind of like the movie Heaven Can Wait, and that kind of aristocrat stuff. Dennis was in that world hobnobbing with the Eastern oligarchy. And in fact, what happened was is that he somehow, and again, Dennis the hero, so somehow he ended up getting involved with a woman who was again some socialite, and they had like artifact, they had like a Picasso painting, original Picasso painting, and other kinds of very expensive pieces of art, etc. And this woman uh, on her deathbed made Dennis promise to take care of her daughter, protect her from actually her father, I guess ex-husband, who wanted to get the inheritance. And so anyway, so Dennis promised that he would take care of this woman's daughter. And after she died, he was, whether he should adopt her or marry her. He decided to marry her. And actually, they soon had a kid who was actually born premature, never left the hospital. She died before she was 1 year old. And Dennis, when he went to Fairleigh Dickinson, was, again, always top of his classes in the honor school. And soon before graduation, he was invited to attend a conference that was hosted by B.F. Skinner. And Dennis actually sat near the stage in this like honors group, these VIP students, or whatever. And anyway, there's this conference that Skinner's giving. And that's, yeah, I have other Skinner connections, like the Noam Chomsky, et cetera. But it's a thing where Skinner, the conference was about how to make the public believe whatever the elites want them to. It was like Pavlov for humans. And this was Skinner's thing. So anyway, so it was about how to manipulate the public and public opinion. And in fact, there are internships you could have with politicians, so you could learn the fine art of manipulating public opinion. And Dennis was horrified by what he saw. It was like he realized. I mean, it's like kind of like realized he was living with vampires or something. He couldn't believe that he was at this conference where it was all about manipulating the public mind, and so he is disgusted, mortified, horrified. And what happened is again, as only Dennis can do, he actually during when Skinner was on stage, Dennis stood up, gave him a Zig Heil, and stormed out of the conference, and then dropped out of school. I mean, all Dennis had to do was submit some paperwork to get a degree, and he said, I'm not going to do that. That's Dennis. In fact, Dennis, yeah, he reminds people how he went to 4 years of college and didn't get a degree, et cetera. So yeah, Dennis, I think probably wishes he had filed that paperwork. But also what happened was his last year there, Fairleigh Dickinson, he again worked, and so he was an aluminum siding salesman for Sears, and Sears, you know, how to say it, mom and apple pie and Sears right back then. And so what happened was he was an aluminum siding salesman for Sears, and he had Sears behind him. So Dennis, again, I've never seen another salesman like Dennis. He's the best salesman I've ever seen or heard of. And so Dennis worked there at Sears, and he sold. Oh, he sold. And he sold. In fact, he made more. His commission check was bigger than the commission checks of everybody else in his department and his boss put together. And he was making more than the president of Fairleigh Dickinson University was back then. And so, in fact, he was like, "What am I getting a degree for? I'm making more money as a salesman than I could ever make, doing that." And so, what happened though was that he was selling, and everybody else kind of standing around at Sears, and Dennis was selling. And what happened was one night he was at a customer's home after midnight closing a deal, and the next morning he showed up like at 8:05, and he showed up 5 minutes late, and he was fired on the spot. And as his boss hands him his final paycheck, he says, "Boy, you made a lot of enemies here." And Dennis was floored. He said, "What'd I do?" And Dennis didn't understand that wasn't his high-powered salesmanship was not a fit with Sears. In fact, that was the last time Dennis worked for somebody as an employee, was then. And so anyway, so there he was, dropped out of college. Now he's fired from his job. And now what? So Dennis then decided he was going to pursue those utopian dreams. And this is probably 1972. Sounds about 1972, I think, when he was doing this. And so what happened was he decided to get into home remodeling, and bring fine craftsmanship back to home remodeling, because back then, again, baby boomer homes were being slapped up. So he was like going to bring fine craftsmanship back to home building. and he actually took on and hired a master craftsman to be his main guy. And he actually hired his brother. His brother was a part of the business, and Dennis had the mishaps you often. I mean, in the small town entrepreneurial waters, he had a couple bots jobs and stuff. And Dennis had to make good, and so, but he was making it happen. He was just getting his head above water when the oil crisis hit in 1973. And the 1973 oil crisis is what ended the post-war boom, which is the most prosperous era of the human journey in the United States. And in fact, what happened was that one of his jobs, he had a supplier who supplied all the materials, et cetera, and it was on a job. So he had this job that they were going to remodel this house, and all the materials Dennis had bought, and they were on site, and they were, and then the owner made a big down payment, and once all the materials were delivered, et cetera, and to remodel his home. And what happened was that in the mayhem, in fact, a lot of construction companies that went bankrupt during that. In fact, I'm aware of this kind of thing happening back then. In fact, cities like the Rust Belt began then, et cetera. So I lived in Springfield, Ohio at one point, and they said, yeah, this town went straight down after the first oil crisis. And so anyway, what happened was his supplier illegally went to where Dennis had all his materials at this house and repossessed them all. And then what happened was when the customer saw the stuff was repossessed illegally, Sparta didn't have a right to do this, but possession is 9/10 of the law. So once they took all that, then the customer stopped payment on his down payment check. And once he did that, Dennis's check started bouncing all over the place. And so Dennis, in fact, at this point, he was married to his wife. The child was in the hospital, and there Dennis was with his business on the edge, failing with bounced checks, etc. So Dennis, what was he? Was he 20? 27 years old, I think. And so he goes to Vegas to gamble up the money to save his business. And actually, Dennis had a system that worked. His whole predicated on the idea that the house cheats. And so what Dennis would do is that he would go to Vegas and sidle up next to a high roller and subtly bet against the high roller, thinking that the house was going to clean out the high roller. And so he bet against the high roller, he'd win. Well, he did. So actually, after several days of this, he actually won like $5,000. His goal was 10,000, but he made 5,000. And Dennis later realized that 5,000 would have bought him out of all of his problems. He would have solved all his problems with those $5,000. And what happened though was right then he called home and his wife said the cops were looking for him. And so Dennis, in a moment of panic, went to the tables and threw all of his $5,000 down on one bet, and of course lost, and went home busted, broke, and faced the music of his failed business. And then he was actually prosecuted for fraud, for bouncing those checks. Yeah, and he didn't. I mean, when he wrote the checks, it was the stop payment that caused all his checks to bounce. It wasn't that Dennis was purposely writing bad checks. But what happened was, I think he got a legal advice, an attorney who was actually associated with his wife's father, who wanted to stick it to Dennis because he was protecting his daughter. Anyway, what happened was Dennis got intentionally bad legal advice, and Dennis actually pled guilty to fraud for those checks bouncing, which was, again, Dennis was a sheep to the shearing. And so anyway, so he pled guilty to fraud. And then what happened was not too long afterwards, he realized he'd been hoodwinked by his attorney. And so he tried to withdraw his plea. And the judge said, we're not even giving you time, son. No, rejected. Case closed. And that guilty plea to fraud haunts Dennis 50 years later, that he did that. And so, but this was his baptism by fire in the business world. And so anyway, and then right at the same time, so right when all this happened, his child actually died. His wife left him, and Dennis was on his own with nothing once again. And so what happened was Dennis, and this is going to be for the next video. So what happened was Dennis went into a room for like 3 days and did what he called automatic writing. And it was, again, genius has worked this way. I've done some of it myself, where basically you get inspired, and next thing you know, you're in the creative throes, and then you produce something that is like, wow. And Dennis did that, and that's what's coming next. So, but that's all for this one tonight. Bye.